Welcome to The Thing About Witch Hunts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
This is Sarah Jack. We are back for Podcasthon 2026. Podcasthon is a global event where podcasters around the world use their platform to raise money for a cause they believe in. Thousands of shows, 1 week.
What we love about this week is that podcasters have built real audiences, and that means important causes that might otherwise go unheard, get shared with the world. We believe in that.
The cause we're focusing on is ending witch hunts. And End Witch Hunts nonprofit is behind this podcast and our sister show, The Thing About Salem. End Witch Hunts is the only U.S. nonprofit dedicated to raising awareness about witchcraft accusation violence worldwide, past and present. You can donate at endwitchhunts.org/donate, and everything goes directly to our work.
Today, we want to do something we've been building towards across years of episodes. We want to name the pattern, not just describe individual witch hunts, but show the anatomy underneath them, what panic is made of, how it's constructed, why it keeps working, and what the people who resist it actually do.
For centuries of American history, there's one blueprint. Let's get into it.
Here's a question we come back to again and again in this work. Why does it keep happening? The Salem Witch Trials ended in 1693. We know what went wrong. We have centuries of scholarship, exoneration legislation, public memory projects, and yet the pattern keeps showing up. Different century, different accusation, same structure.
Sociologists have a term for it: moral panic, a widespread, disproportionate fear that some person or group threatens the very foundation of the safety of a community. And what makes that term useful is not just the word panic, it's the word moral. These episodes are always framed as a defense of something sacred: the godly community, the nation, the children.
The panic presents itself as righteous, as necessary, as the only reasonable response to a genuine threat. When we interviewed Dr. Scott Culpepper about the Satanic Panic of the 1980s and 1990s, one of the things that struck us most was how familiar the structure felt. Parents terrified their children were being abused in satanic rituals. Daycare workers prosecuted on testimony from very young children. Law enforcement agencies training officers to identify signs of devil worship.
And underneath all of it, the same engine that drove the Salem court in 1692. A community convinced it was under threat from an invisible enemy, an enemy that could only be identified by those who claimed special knowledge, an enemy whose presence explained suffering that had no other easy answer.
That is the pattern. And once you can name it, you start to see it across American history. The Connecticut witch trials of the 1660s, the Red Scares of 1886 and 1919, McCarthyism, the Satanic Panic. And today we look at contemporary witchcraft accusation violence around the world, in Nigeria, in Papua New Guinea, in India, in America.
What we want to do today is pull that pattern apart. Not because naming it makes it stop, but because the people who disrupted witch hunts across history were almost always people who could see it clearly enough to name what they were looking at. That recognition is the first move.
The first thing to understand about moral panics is that they present themselves as inevitable, as something that simply happened. A community under pressure, fear takes hold, things spiral. But when you look closely at the history, that is not what you actually find.
Panic is constructed. Somebody builds it.
Sociologists sometimes talk about a conducive landscape of fear. The conditions that make a community vulnerable to a moral panic are almost never manufactured from nothing. In Salem in 1692, those conditions were overwhelming. Massachusetts had lost its colonial charter and did not know what government it was living under. It was in the middle of an active frontier war.
Smallpox had been moving through communities. Refugees from destroyed settlements were arriving in Salem Village. people who had survived Wabanaki and French raids on the frontier. There was grinding economic anxiety and long-running church disputes.
Cotton Mather, one of the most powerful ministers in Massachusetts, captured that accumulated dread in his book, The Wonders of the Invisible World, his account of the Salem Witch Trials. He did not see a few troubled girls in Salem Village. He saw a diabolical conspiracy.
He authoritatively wrote that an army of devils had broken in upon what he called the firstborn of English settlements, that a witch plot had been designed to blow up and pull down all the churches in the country. He used the confessions of the accused, many of whom we now know confessed under extreme duress, as proof that they had signed the devil's book.
Mather was doing something sociologists would recognize as magnification. A localized set of incidents, the unexplained illnesses of Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, became a vehicle for the colony's accumulated, uncontrollable anxieties.
And Cotton was not a fringe figure writing pamphlets in a cellar. He was one of the most prominent ministers in New England. His willingness to frame the accusations as evidence of a vast satanic conspiracy gave those accusations institutional weight they could not have carried on their own.
That brings us to elite sponsorship. For a panic to escalate into a full witch hunt, it needs buy-in from people in authority, the people who control courts and laws and pulpits and printing presses. Without Mather, without judges like Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, without Governor Phipps, the initial accusations would not have had the machinery they needed to execute 20 people and imprison over 100 more.
But it is crucial to understand that those were decisions, not inevitable outcomes. Every step of the escalation at Salem involved human choices. Magistrates chose to accept spectral evidence, testimony from dreams and visions as legally valid. Ministers, with some notable exceptions, chose to endorse the proceedings.
Thomas Brattle, a Boston merchant and scientist, was already writing letters in October 1692 calling the court's methods indefensible. And Increase Mather, the father of Cotton, himself ultimately wrote that it was better for 10 witches to go free than for one innocent person to be executed.
Executions had continued from June through September. Those were choices made by specific people who had other options available to them. The conducive landscape of fear opened a door. The moral entrepreneurs, the ministers, the magistrates, the political figures who shaped the legal response walked through that door.
This matters because it means panic is not a natural disaster. It is not something that descends on a helpless community like a storm. It is made. People with authority and standing make decisions that transform fear into panic. And things that are made, like panics, can be understood, interpreted, and ultimately unmade.
That is one of the reasons we do this work through End Witch Hunts. Every person who understands the mechanics of witch hunts becomes harder to recruit into a witch hunt.
The second element of the anatomy of panic is the role of institutions. Fear can ignite in a community, but it does not become a witch hunt until the people in authority decide to treat the accusation as legitimate. Once they do, everything changes for the accused.
Think about what made Salem possible. The colonial Massachusetts legal system accepted spectral evidence. The clergy, with important exceptions, largely validated the proceedings. The governor authorized the special court of Oyer and Terminer. Once those institutions committed, ordinary skeptics had almost no standing to object. The accused had no recourse. Institutional legitimacy is what transforms accusations into prosecution.
We talked about this with D. Britton Simons when we discussed the pre-Salem Boston witch trials, the executions of Goody Glover in 1688, of Anne Hibbins in 1656, of Margaret Jones in 1648, happened because the legal and religious infrastructure of the Massachusetts Bay Colony treated witchcraft as a prosecutable offense with a functioning evidentiary framework. The institution made the accusation real.
And you can trace that same mechanism across every panic that followed. When institutions adopt the framework of the panic has the force of law behind it. When they refuse to or withdraw that endorsement, the panic loses its most powerful engine.
The Satanic Panic illustrates this with devastating clarity. The FBI circulated training materials about satanic ritual abuse. Prosecutors across the country brought cases. The McMartin preschool case in California, the Fells Acres case in Massachusetts, the Bakersfield cases were not fringe events pursued by zealots on the margins.
They were pursued by mainstream law enforcement and prosecuted by mainstream district attorneys. The institution of child protection, law enforcement, and the courts all adopted the framework of the panic, and that adoption is what gave it the power to destroy families and send innocent people to prison for decades.
The McMartin case lasted 7 years. It was the longest and most expensive criminal trial in American history at that time. No convictions were ever obtained, but the families accused had their lives destroyed. That happened because institutions treated unverified claims as credible.
We see the same dynamic of unverified claims in contemporary witchcraft accusations and violence, as well as past witch trial accusations. In communities where religious leaders, local authorities, or family elders publicly identify someone as a harmful witch, the accusation carries institutional weight. That's one of the reasons Dr. Leo Igwe's work with advocacy for alleged witches in Africa is so important. Part of what AFWA does is engage those same institutions and work to change the institutional response to accusations of witchcraft.
Because once an institution says this is real and this person is the threat, everything changes for the accused. And once an institution says this is not a basis for action, the panic loses one of its most powerful engines.
The third element of the anatomy of panic is target selection, and the choice of the target is never random.
Every moral panic needs a folk devil, a figure who embodies the threat the community fears: the witch, the Bolshevist, the satanic cult member. The folk devil is never simply invented from nothing. It is assembled out of existing fears and existing prejudices. And the people who fill that role are almost always people the dominant culture has already decided it is acceptable to fear, to distrust, or to discard. Folk devil is a term that was used by author Stanley Cohen in his book Folk Devils and Moral Panics, which was based on a PhD thesis he had worked on between 1967 and 1969. He had used the term folk devil, and he came up with the term moral panic for this kind of thing that's also known as a social panic.
At Salem, that included people like Rebecca Nurse, 71 years old, a respected church member, accused anyways. And it included Tituba, an enslaved woman from Barbados, who was among the first accused and who had no standing to refuse to confess. Mary Black was also an enslaved woman accused and imprisoned. Also enslaved, Candy of Barbados was accused and forced to demonstrate supposed acts of witchcraft in court. The authorities had her do it in court. Their stories are part of Salem's history in ways that the popular memory of the trials has often overlooked.
And the targeting at Salem cannot be separated from the fact that the colony was living under the terror of King William's War. Wabanaki raids on colonial settlements had driven refugees into the village. Several of the accusers had survived frontier attacks. That fear of a real enemy at the borders fused with the fear of an invisible enemy within, and the Wabanaki became part of the demonology of the trials. The devil and his agents were described in testimony in terms that reflected the colonists' terror of the people whose land they had taken.
That pattern did not end with Salem. As the new United States expanded westward, the same structure repeated. Indigenous nations were cast as a threat requiring elimination. The language of savagery and heathenism served the same function that witchcraft accusations had served. It made dispossession and violence feel like defense rather than aggression. That was not incidental. It was policy, justified by fear, and it was sustained by the same institutional endorsement that sustained Salem's witch trials.
The vulnerability of being already outside the circle of protection is the thread that connects Salem to every panic that followed. Nowhere is that clearer than in how McCarthyism operated in relation to Black Americans pressing for civil rights. The accusation of communist influence was deployed specifically and deliberately against Black leaders, artists, and organizers. Paul Robeson lost his passport and his career. W.E.B. Du Bois was indicted as a foreign agent at the age of 83.
The NAACP was pressured to purge members with left-wing associations. The panic served to fracture and silence the civil rights movement at the very moment it was gaining momentum. That was not a coincidence.
And the Satanic Panic showed how the same targeting logic works when institutions built it into their operating frameworks. Law enforcement agencies developed occult crime training programs in the 1980s that explicitly conflated African diaspora spiritual practices with Satanism, Santeria altars, voodoo iconography. Palo Mayombe ritual objects were treated in training manuals as evidence of criminal activity.
Practitioners faced raids and surveillance, not because of anything they had done, but because their religion looked unfamiliar and uncomfortable to investigators who had been trained to be afraid of it.
The fourth element is one of the most important to hold on to because it requires holding two things at once. Moral panics use genuine fear as cover for other agendas.
The fear is real. People in the grip of a moral panic are not pretending. Salem in 1692 was a community that had lost its royal charter, did not know what government it was living under, was in the middle of an active war, had survived smallpox, and was watching neighbors arrive as refugees from destroyed settlements. And layered beneath all of that was a theological terror that Puritan New England had been living with for generations, the belief that Satan was an active conspirator personally recruiting an army within their community to destroy the godly.
But underneath that genuine fear, other forces were operating. Forces that had nothing to do with protecting the community and everything to do with using the panic to achieve other ends. In Salem, the people most active in pressing charges had specific grievances, specific rivalries, specific relationships with the accused. Fear created the opening, other agendas moved through it. Dr. Leo Igwe has described the same pattern in contemporary witchcraft accusation violence in Nigeria and across sub-Saharan Africa. The belief in witchcraft is genuine, deeply embedded in community life, but accusations frequently surface at moments of inheritance conflict, property dispute, or family tension. Someone stands to gain from the removal of the person accused. The accusation provides a framework that makes that removal feel righteous rather than predatory.
Dr. Scott Culpepper made a point about the Satanic Panic that applies to all of these panics. Some people driving it genuinely believe every word they were saying, and some understood exactly what they were doing. Both of those mindsets can be operating in the same panic at the same time.
That is what makes it so difficult to interrupt from the inside. The true believers provide the cover. The opportunists provide the structure that keeps the true believers organized and moving in the same direction.
We want to spend some time talking about the American Red Scares because they show how durable this framework of panic is.
In 1886, the Haymarket riot in Chicago sparked the first major Red Scare in American history. A labor rally in Haymarket Square turned catastrophic when a bomb was thrown at police. 7 officers died, and the actual bomb thrower was never identified.
But the panic that followed did not require identification. Newspapers immediately moved to frame the violence not as an isolated incident, but as a prelude to outright revolution. Labor organizers, many of them German-born, were described in print as hyenas, vermin, wolves. Their foreign birth became proof of alien contagion.
The response was massively disproportionate to the actual threat. This is one of the hallmarks that identifies a moral panic. The action taken is far in excess of the objective harm. Prosecutors targeted labor leaders not for the specific act of throwing a bomb, but for encouraging violence through speech or print. 8 men were convicted and 4 were executed. One died by suicide before his execution.
By 1888, the panic had already shaped legislation designed to remove dangerous aliens from U.S. territory. The folk devil of the foreign radical had done its work.
Then, in 1919, after the First World War, the conditions were ripe again. Rapid post-war inflation, massive unemployment, and labor unrest. Over 3,600 strikes involving 4 million workers in a single year created that conducive landscape of fear. Headlines screamed about a Bolshevist nightmare. The folk devil was updated. Now it was not just the foreign radical, but the Leninist agent, the invisible Soviet operative, working to Sovietize the American government.
Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and his deputy, J. Edgar Hoover, served as the moral entrepreneurs for this panic. They fanned the alarm and shaped it into a campaign of suppression. The Palmer raids of January 1920 were the result. In a single night, federal agents swept through 23 states and detained over 6,000 people.
Many non-citizens were deported through administrative proceedings specifically designed to bypass the protections of a full court trial. The same logic that Cotton Mather used to justify accepting the testimony of the afflicted girls at Salem, that a sacred cause requires extraordinary measures, was operating in the Palmer raids. Palmer and Hoover wanted to fan the flames of fear. They wanted people to be more alarmed and continue to be worried about this red threat. And so they decided that there was going to be a revolution on May Day to put in this Soviet version of America.
The panic began to collapse under the weight of its own implausibility. But it had already succeeded in embedding anti-radical sentiment and a xenophobic 100% Americanism into immigration law and state sedition statutes that outlasted the panic itself.
And then, 30 years later, Senator Joseph McCarthy, his claim that a conspiracy so immense was operating within the American government that it dwarfed all previous threats in the history of the nation, mirrored almost exactly Cotton Mather's claim that an army of devils had targeted the firstborn of English settlements. The scale was different. The theological vocabulary was gone. The structure was identical.
The folk devil had shifted again. Now it was the card-carrying communists, the security risk hiding within federal agencies, the Hollywood writer with subversive sympathies. Thousands of people were blacklisted or fired based not on documented, verified actions, but on association, accusations, suspicion.
The institutional machinery that made it possible, loyalty programs, the House Un-American Activities Committee, the Smith Act, provided the same function that Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton's Court of Interminer had provided in the Salem Witch Trials. Elite sponsorship transformed accusation into official action. And as we noted in the segment on target selection, the accusation of communist influence was deployed with particular force against Black leaders, artists, and civil rights organizers.
Senator Joseph R. McCarthy's collapse came in 1954 during the televised Army McCarthy hearings when attorney Joseph Welch's question to McCarthy, "Have you no sense of decency?" became a turning point. The panic's volatility turned against the man who had driven it, but the damage was done, and the apparatus, the laws, the surveillance infrastructure survived the man who had given it his name.
Perhaps the most instructive parallel to Salem for our purposes is the Satanic Panic of the 1980s and 1990s, because it happened in living memory, and it is the one we tend to remember least accurately.
The conducive landscape of fear in this case was a set of genuine social anxieties: rising divorce rates, the rapid entry of women into the workforce, and the expansion of daycare, the sexual revolution, and within certain religious communities, a renewed focus on Satan as an active force in the world. The fear that children were vulnerable, that institutions intended to protect them might be sites of harm.
Into that landscape stepped a specific set of moral entrepreneurs, self-described former Satanists touring churches with fabricated testimonies, therapists using what became known as recovered memory techniques, including regression hypnosis, that planted false memories in patients and in children, publishers and talk show producers who understood that stories about satanic ritual abuse reached enormous audiences.
The result was a self-reinforcing system. Children who had been subjected to suggestive interview techniques by therapists and investigators came to believe and to testify that they had witnessed ritual murders, cannibalism, and abuse in secret tunnels that did not exist. Investigators from the FBI and Interpol searched. They found nothing: no bodies, no tunnels, no films.
But the institutional machinery had already committed. Legal systems in multiple states modified evidentiary standards to accommodate the sacred cause of child protection. In Bakersfield, California, 28 people went to prison, some for over 20 years, for crimes that did not occur.
It was not until the 1990s that the panic's volatility turned against itself. Child witnesses grew up and began to recant, describing the pressures they had been under to produce testimony that adults wanted to hear. Is this Salem? Journalists, including Dorothy Rabinowitz at the Wall Street Journal, began systematically documenting the evidentiary failures underlying major prosecutions.
The pattern the Satanic Panic followed was Salem's pattern, a conducive landscape of fear, moral entrepreneurs with institutional standing who built and amplified the panic, elite sponsorship from law enforcement and the legal system, target selection that fell hardest on people with the least institutional protection, and a collapse eventually when the panic's claims proved impossible to sustain against the evidence. The fifth element of the anatomy of a panic is what happens after. Moral panics try to make themselves forgotten or misremembered, and the way we talk about historical panics shapes whether we can recognize them when they reoccur.
The dominant framework for remembering Salem has often been the phrase mass hysteria. It positions what happened as a kind of group psychological breakdown, communities losing their minds under stress. The problem with that frame is what it erases. It erases the human decisions made at every stage of the escalation. It erases the institutional participation and the elite sponsorship. It erases the people who were not hysterical at all, who raised objections, who tried to protect the accused.
It turns the panic into weather, something that descended on a helpless community rather than something that was built and sustained by specific choices. And it makes it harder to recognize the pattern when it appears again, because the next panic rarely looks like madness from the inside. It looks like a serious institutional response to a serious threat.
The Satanic Panic is particularly instructive here because the memory hole is so recent and so large. Dozens of people served decades in prison for crimes that did not happen. The therapeutic and law enforcement communities that drove the panic have largely avoided accountability, and the panic itself has not fully ended. It has migrated into conspiracy frameworks that continue to circulate today, carrying the same core claim that a hidden network of powerful people is systematically abusing children, and that only those with special knowledge can identify them.
The work of historical exoneration is partly about correcting the record on specific individuals. When Connecticut passed House Joint Resolution 34 in 2023, absolving the victims of the colonial witch trials, that was an act of historical reckoning for specific people. Winifred Benham, Mary Sanford, Nathaniel and Rebecca Greensmith, people whose names had been attached to a shameful proceeding for 3.5 centuries. Exoneration allows us to reframe how we remember people so we can remember these victims of witch trials as the innocent people that they really were.
Yes, it's about reminding and changing public memory of what happened to them, making it harder to flatten the story into legend. How many witch legends are based on real people? Too many. The Massachusetts Witch Hunt Justice Project is working right now toward the same thing that we did in Connecticut for the 8 people convicted in Boston before the Salem Witch Trials. You can learn about those specific stories and support this exoneration by reading the petition, signing the petition, and sharing it. That's available at change.org/witch trials.
When the history is accurately remembered, it is a resource. People can reach for it. They can say, I've seen this before. I know what this is. That recognition is one of the most important tools we have. And that is part of why this podcast exists. Not just to tell stories from the past, but to make those stories usable.
The 6th thing the history of moral panic teaches us is that not everyone panics. In every hunt that we've covered on this show across centuries and continents, there were people who looked at what was happening and asked questions.
During the Salem Witch Trials, as we mentioned, Thomas Brattle wrote a letter in October 1692. This letter methodically dismantled the court's evidentiary standards. Thomas was a merchant, a scientist, a founding member of what would become Harvard College. He was not a fringe figure. He laid out clearly and without emotion exactly why the proceedings were unreliable and unjust.
Robert Pike, a magistrate himself, had been putting his objections to the use of spectral evidence on record since the summer. And don't forget, Increase Mather ultimately took the position that it was better for 10 witches to go free than for one innocent person to be executed. These were all people with institutional standing who used that standing to resist. The dissenters are in the record. They are always there, but they are not always who gets remembered. The panic tends to occupy more of the historical memory than the resistance to the panic.
In the Satanic Panic, there were prosecutors who looked at the cases being brought and declined to pursue them. There were therapists who publicly criticized the interview methods being used with the children. Dorothy Rabinowitz at the Wall Street Journal, we mentioned earlier, did that work at personal and professional risk in a climate where questioning the cases was treated as an attack on child victims rather than a defense of due process.
In contemporary Africa, Dr. Leah Igwe has spent decades standing publicly against witchcraft accusation violence in a context where that position carries great personal risk. The advocates we have heard from in dozens of episodes on this podcast, including our recent International Women's Day panel, which featured Mamanat Mohammed, a survivor of witchcraft accusations, are actively doing work in their communities right now. Mamanat recently told us,
I grew up being called a witch. Myself, my mom, and my stepmother, because our father died earlier. So I lost him at 10, and the entire community, we were treated bad, right? People don't want to interact with us. I remember one time I was 10 and someone carried cutlass to harm my mother because according to them, she killed her husband. In my community, Nupi community, oftentimes when a man dies, they accuse the wife. So in this case, not just my mother was accused, but also her children. that were responsible for his death. And a lot of dehumanizing things happened at the time, and nobody in the community said anything. Nobody stood for us. We were treated like we were not a member of that community. We were not part of the community. And it stayed for more than 20 years. I didn't know there was I didn't know of any organization, anybody, anything, anyone at all that you could speak to about the behaviors, or do I say the accusations and the actions that come from people of the community. And we had to endure all of this. It was not an easy experience for any of us. Imagine growing up in a community where nobody wants to talk to you, nobody wants to interact with you. When you come, they chase you away like you're a plague. And it's not just 1 year, for over 20 years. If I want to get married now, if it's in my community, they will tell you that girl, that she and her mother are witches. I don't know if you understand. It affected us for a long time. Even though I am educated, my mom also has some level of education, but the rural community, they don't care. And when you are a big example of the witchcraft in the community, at a point you begin to assume, or you begin to question yourself, are you sure I'm not a witch? Okay, and how do I even know if I am not a witch?
Another of the things Maimonat said that stayed with us was how long the community ostracism lasted after her mother was accused, more than 20 years. She described being a child standing in the doorway of her home, defending her mother.
This is not a passive story. This is a child who recognized an injustice and stood against it with the only tools she had.
The dissenters across history are not always people with power or standing. They are sometimes children. They are sometimes neighbors with no formal authority. They are sometimes people writing letters that will not be read for another century. They are sometimes magistrates who put an objection on the record, knowing it will be ignored. But they are always there.
And finding them, naming them, including them in the story is part of what this work is about. Because the anatomy of a panic is not only a story about what panic does, it is also a story about what people choose to do when they recognize it.
Every person who can name a witch hunt in progress becomes a potential dissenter, and that is not a small thing.
And Witch Hunts works to connect the historical record to the present moment. We name what is happening to people accused of witchcraft today, and we work to build the public understanding so that the law and advocacy and community infrastructure can protect the vulnerable in our communities today.
If this episode has resonated with you, we would love your support. You can donate at endwitchhunts.org/donate. End Witch Hunts is still growing, still building its community of supporters, and every contribution at this stage genuinely matters.
Thank you for joining us for our Podcasthon episode for 2026. If a donation is not possible right now, sharing this episode is a real help. Every new listener is another person who knows what a witch hunt looks like and can talk about it.
And have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.